Welcome to a seminar organized by the Swedish Center for Impacts of Climate Extremes, Climes. And we have today with us Maria Rusca, visiting from the University of Manchester, whom those of you who have been here for a couple of years may know from when she was working here in Uppsala, who is one of the rare social scientists who has worked on integrating social sciences with quantitative hydrology and climate science, which is actually a very hard thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so Maria today is going to tell us a bit about how this journey that took several years and is still ongoing went and what it involves. So Maria, on to you.
Thank you very much.
I also add, I'm sorry, Maria, to our online guests. Please, if you're able to turn on your cameras, we have a specific screen that we can show you. So we want to feel your presence. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gabriele and Murat. Thank you, Climes, for the invitation. I know some of you because I've worked here a few years ago, and a lot of the work that I'm presenting here has actually been developed with colleagues here at Uppsala University, including Gabriele, Giuliano, Sara Linderson, and then those who are not anymore at Uppsala University, Maurizio Mazzoleni and Elena Raffetti, who may be still at Uppsala University, actually, I don't know. But yes, it's great to be here. I will present some of this work that we have done to try and integrate climate, hydrological, and social sciences. And the social sciences that I am working with is a particular, obviously, subfields within the social sciences, which focuses really on understanding the role of power and economic politics in shaping environmental governance and climate governance and the outcomes, uneven outcomes of these processes. So I am aware here that I'm explaining, I'm talking to an audience, at least in this room, of people who know climate hazards and climate extremes, weather extremes, much better than I do. But I'm still starting with a couple of examples. The first example is about Houston. And Hurricane Harvey in Houston, which went down in history for the extreme precipitation, which also then led to significant flooding in the city of Houston. It is now down for one of the costliest storms in the US, and there were many deaths, particularly in cities, and particularly in the city of Houston. So at that time, when the hurricane was happening, there were these tweets by the hopefully back then President of the United States, Truman, who was very vocal about the intensity of the extreme events, including these comments like, wow, epic and historic, highlighting the fact that this was a unique event. The messages were, in my opinion, out of touch because of the moment. This was tweeted in the moment in which people were experiencing these extreme events. But also, I thought it was quite interesting that this strategy of used by many politicians to emphasize the frequency or the intensity of an extreme event and the natural dimension, concealing the politics underlying then the disasters, and emphasizing the natural elements to deflect attention from the responsibilities, political responsibilities of not obviously the hurricane per se, but how its impact unfolded in different parts of the United States and Houston in particular, so Louisiana and Texas and Houston in particular. And indeed, we found that there were very different uneven impacts across urban spaces in Houston, and that tracts that were inhabited by racial minorities and low-income groups were significantly more affected. Lower-income households had almost twice as much damage than higher-income households. And lower-income households also experienced a lot of exposure to toxic pollutants, very often not only in the US, but even in the UK and in many other places. I will assume that lower income neighborhoods are located close to industrial facilities where there is more pollution, air pollution very often, and that also has an impact during flooding because toxic spills affected these communities the most. And what we see in the immediate of the hurricane is also reflected in the recovery trajectories, where low-income residents took much longer to recover from the events. And here is a second example, and this is the heat waves in northern India and Delhi over the past few years. Obviously, Delhi has, and the north of India has a very hot weather, but generally the hot season is between April and August, while in the past few years there has been, heat has started to become quite elevated already in March. So there is a more extended period of heat, and in many parts of northern India, approximately 60%, the heat was above average. And here again, you can see that the impacts are very different across socioeconomic groups. I think air conditioning is the one really elements of difference, which also means that some areas, some households are cool and other households are very warm. And the type of work, of course, that different socioeconomic groups also have. So for those who are working in farms and who work with a daily wage and don't have a salary, the heat waves means that they still have to work outside despite the heat conditions because their livelihoods depend on that. And so construction workers, farmers were particularly affected, and the marginalized within the marginalized, or those who are more at risk within these groups, are also women. On the one hand, because of the heat of the households, particularly in informal settlements, is sometimes 20 degrees above that of higher income residents, and also because there is an increase in intimate partner violence very often during these heat waves. So there is a range of risks that come with these extreme events that are really very diverse and also very gendered. And so the point of these examples is that they also highlight some trends that are quite important to consider. One is that climate extremes are becoming more frequent, and there's so often that you can consider them exceptional before you need to start thinking about them as a new norm. And the other element is that these climate extremes generate uneven impacts across urban spaces and intra-urban and rural spaces. And as we have seen in this couple of examples, the urban scale is quite critical when it comes to understanding the impacts of these climate extremes. And obviously, there are several reasons for that. One of the reasons is that in cities, you have a large concentration of people. Above 50% of the population now lives in urban areas. You have a concentration of economic assets. You have a concentration of cultural assets and financial activities in cities, which are therefore quite exposed to these changing weather patterns. Population is growing, particularly in cities in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. So while Europe is tending to plateau, these areas are still growing significantly. And that means that there is obviously more challenges with the climate extremes, but also potentially more opportunities to think about a city, think before the city grows for how to integrate, how to develop cities to accommodate the growing population. So it's a challenge, but to be more optimistic, we can think about it also as an opportunity. And the other element, which is very important in cities, is that the cities are highly unequal in terms of infrastructures, access to basic services, housing facilities. And so the adaptation gap is quite uneven from one area to the other. I think possibly like the IPCC report argues, one of the most significant gaps, visible gaps, is that of informal settlements. And cities that have large informal settlement have areas that are quite resilient and areas that are very much at risk of a range of extreme events and hazards. The fact that cities are so important in relation to adaptation is also shown by the SDGs. Target 11 focuses on adaptation, and particularly it focuses on disaster risk reduction and on reducing deaths, particularly of those of more vulnerable groups. And so in the rest of the presentation, having basically outlined this idea of climate extremes as becoming more frequent and a sort of new normal and the importance of cities, I will focus on 3 points. The first is that managing intensifying climate risks requires actionable insights into future climates. I think that's something we can all agree on. The question is what actionable information means and how we can make that information more relevant in terms of also of inclusive and just urban futures. I will look at current approaches very briefly, highlighting the potential of these approaches and what are the limitations of these approaches, and then I will propose a framework that seeks to extend information on future climates in a way that it can empower end users, which could be local governments, city governments, but also civil society actors or civil protection, and that can generate information that I call justice focused to argue that it's information that should help us to develop more inclusive and equitable policies to adapt to climate change. So when it comes to increased actionable information, I think there are a few points that have emerged from literature and from our own research. And that applies both, I think, I'm talking here from the social science perspective, but I think it would apply equally for the physical climate science perspective. With intensifying climate change, past events are not so much a reliable source of information to understand how to address intensifying climate extremes. And so there is a need to generate a different type of information. From a social science perspective, I would say, and from a policy perspective, actionable also means generating information that is relevant for specific users. And so not only information which is generally explaining some trends, but trying to explore and explain how these trends will unfold in a specific location. And so that requires very granular analysis of the impacts of these extremes in a specific city or in a specific region. And then in this really central for my field, political ecology and climate justice, is that addressing uneven outcomes of climate extremes also requires understanding the systemic inequalities, how and why certain groups are more affected by climate extremes. And this also entails thinking about issues like racial capitalism, colonial legacies, patriarchy, and how these actually shape current vulnerabilities to climate change impacts at different scales. Recently, there has been a study by Kemp and colleagues, which is very highly cited. I know Gabriele doesn't love that study, but it makes a point that if we are to understand how to respond to climate change, we should think about not only business as usual, which is let's say bad scenarios, but also thinking about worst case scenarios. And that is, for example, thinking about climate extremes that are unlikely to happen, but would have significant impacts if they would happen, or climate extremes that don't have linear impacts and that might have cascading impacts, and which might magnify the impacts of those extremes. Some people would say that this is a form of doomism, but the authors of the paper say there is a difference between catastrophic projection of the futures, and basically as something that is unavoidable, and an idea of worst case scenario that is actually developed to try and think how to address that particular worst case scenario. I think this is just, I wanted to discuss this because later on I will also propose the opposites, that we also should try and think about best case scenarios as a way of reimagining urban futures. But so I thought, let's also look and give space to voices that talk about even worst case scenarios. And so now the current approaches. Feel free to interrupt me, because what I will say probably is maybe it's my interpretation, with the help also of Gabriele actually, but of different approaches to generate climate information. It might be that what I say, or you disagree, or you find it's a simplification, but we can discuss it either now or afterwards. But so this is how currently climate information about the future is generated, and also by whom. And I think what we see, with the exception perhaps of economics, is that the climate information on futures is mostly generated within the field of climate sciences, and through models and projections, for example, which provide a wealth of information on future climates at the regional and global scales. These are mainly probabilistic approaches, and the resolutions they have, the information that is provided, is more likely to be useful to national and international scales actor rather than to local scales, which is where urban government need to make their decisions and develop their adaptation plans. There are also quite complex information which are not easy to interpret for many users. So particularly the inbuilt uncertainties. This is very simple for you, and for me it was a long process to learn about these different methods, but I think it's important to trace a little bit this trajectory. And physical storylines, I don't know if you're familiar with this approach, they have become more common in the past few years and also used in the IPCC report. They interpret the data of these models in ways that provide a more qualitative narrative, which is more event-based. So how would the drought that unfolds in a given location look like, rather than probabilistic? And in that sense, they are easier to be used by local actors. But at the same time, both of these approaches still have, according to what we propose, a number of gaps. One is that they do not account for how and why risk is unevenly distributed across urban spaces. So, and that's mostly because there is little engagement with social sciences that really focus on these dimensions. The other critique is that these approaches are top-down, so they tend the storylines or the scenarios or the projections are developed within one field and within the academia, so they only account for one perspective of climate change and climate futures. And they also overlook imaginaries of alternative development pathways. So they do not consider really how those who experience those climate extremes, and particularly the most marginalized groups that are more vulnerable, experience this extreme and envision alternative to current trajectories. So in a way, you could say they are very important for the information they provide, but alone they cannot help us to inform policy processes that are more inclusive and that are more transformative. And so over the past few years, and with groups of people from Uppsala University, as well as with a lot of colleagues from the social sciences that I really that have done very significant and important work on urban adaptation and disaster risk reduction and on decolonizing climate knowledge, have looked at developing different approaches that can extend these approaches or pluralize these approaches to also integrate different types of information that is more power-focused, sensitive to power relations, that provides, that also makes room and attention for marginalized epistemologies. So not so much centered only on climate science, but also centered on social science, not so much centered on knowledge that is produced within academia only, but also drawing on the knowledge of those who experience these impacts of climate change. And not only in terms of integrating this knowledge, but also thinking about what type of alternative adaptation visions do people have who actually are at risks the most of these impacts. So obviously today I will present only a part of the framework because first of all it's the one that we have worked most together. But also I thought it might be the most interesting for this seminar in particular. So I'll focus first of all on the power-sensitive storylines, which try to bring together climate projections or physical climate storylines with political, ecological, and climate justice analysis of adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And so the questions that we try to answer is not only how the event will unfold, whether it's a drought or a flood in a given location, but also try to understand how power relation, differential agency of different socioeconomic groups and economic visions of a city or of a country will shape the outcomes of unprecedented event. And I think it's pretty clear that there has been a call already since a couple of decades for developing more interdisciplinary research, both in water and in climate. But this has not been very easy to achieve. I think there are some big differences between these approaches without entering the axiological differences. Political ecology and climate and critical disaster studies tend to do retrospective analysis or histories of the present to understand how we came to a certain uneven outcomes, but they are less focused on analysis of the future, whilst climate projections are more oriented to understanding future climates. The scales of the analysis is often different. We operate at local scales, while projections are likely to be more global or regional. And climate projection largely utilize numerical data, while our political ecological analysis tend to be developed with qualitative data. And so there are these significant differences which we have tried to overcome by developing an approach that doesn't, I shouldn't say that because in the next proposal we will say the opposite, but doesn't try to integrate, but tries to necessarily each set of data, but tries to combine them and add, recognizing the epistemological and methodological value of different disciplines without trying to subsume one of the disciplines into the methodological rules of another one. And so, as you can see, we have 4 pillars that we have on which our approach is grounded, which together are used to develop a scenario. A first pillar is we have our climate projections, and then we have 3 pillars that are grounded on critical social science. The first one is more an analysis of theories and empirical cases across different contexts to try and identify trends in responses, societal responses to a specific event. It could be a flood, and try to identify how in different contexts and if in different contexts there are processes that seem to be similar. But obviously, from our social science perspective, we consider that contexts matter, and so each institutional, political, and cultural context will generate different dynamics, and so we also do empirical research. It's a very labor-intensive approach, but so if we are to do, for example, a scenario of a particular city, we will look at similar events occurred in the past to understand how these events unfold in that context. And then we have a fourth pillar that, again, is empirical analysis of a similar event of greater intensity elsewhere, to try and see if we can infer some of these impacts also for the city for which we are doing the scenario. So I'll come with a practical example of this, which might help. So we have tested our approach looking indeed at Hurricane Harvey. We have tried to hindcast Hurricane Harvey by using only information that was available before Hurricane Harvey. Gabriele has worked on the projections of whether it was realistic and possible, probable to think that a hurricane would have affected hit Houston. And then I have focused on a literature review on floods in cities to look at which trends we have were common in different cities. Hurricane Harvey, Houston has been affected by storms and hurricanes before, and I've used those to see what patterns, what dynamics, socio-political dynamics unfolded in the past. And then we have used Hurricane Katrina as an example of more extreme flooding and events that to try and infer what else might happen in Houston if an event of greater magnitude would happen. And then we have done our hindcast and checked, confirmed our findings with what actually happened in Houston in 2017. And we found that the hindcast was quite reliable and close. In fact, the reviewers of the paper suggested that we can claim that it was even closer to reality than we had initially indicated.
Just one question. What do you mean by climate projection is
You can respond.
So in this case, we looked at the regional climate projections that have been done before 2016 or whenever Harvey was.
Yeah. I probably could have answered that too, but I panicked as soon as you said projection. So we've done this just to highlight, if I have a few more minutes before moving to the next point, yeah? Just to highlight some of the trends that we have identified in our review, this is related to flooding, which we then also found in Houston, is that intersectional dimensions of inequality shape the vulnerability to these climate extremes, to this, in this case, the flooding. Class, race, gender, and socioeconomic inequalities will shape how able you are to leave if there is evacuate, if there is an extreme, if there's a flood or a flood. Housing facilities are quite different across urban spaces. Some are better able to withstand climate extremes, while in other flooding, in this case, while in other cases it is more difficult for social groups to evacuate and to stay in their homes because the houses won't withstand flooding. There are significant housing inequalities, and these dynamics are then reproduced in the aftermath of. There is something. Sorry. Oh, there you go. And so the other point was to think, okay, well, how and why are these differences developed? So we have looked at something that you could has been called as vulnerability in production, or as a disaster as a social construct. The idea that disasters are produced through the political economy of the city by, for example, policies that concentrate investment in certain parts of the city, and while other parts of the cities are excluded. So this idea of concentration of services and resources and marginalizations from services and resources. And of course, the fact that a lot of these dynamics are also reproduced in the aftermath of a disaster. So Naomi Klein uses the term of disaster capitalism to highlight that there are many, that there is a profit-seeking, disasters can be a profit-seeking enterprise, for example, real estate, large construction company, or even many cases by replacing affordable housing with more profitable housing and so on and so forth, which are likely to exacerbate inequality in the aftermath and create greater vulnerabilities of lower income groups. Just to highlight that we've done another scenario after hindcasting Houston, we actually did our first scenario using empirical data from Elisa Savelli, who did a PhD on Cape Town, and from my previous research in Mozambique, and we have developed a first scenario in Maputo. Now we are still working on it. I think there is, with physical climate storylines, we will probably be able to generate, improve and refine this method, but it has given us an opportunity to think about the potential of this interdisciplinary work. For example, I think that this approaches, by providing an interdisciplinary vision of future climates, provide an impact-focused analysis on the criticalities of social justice, but also on the uneven impacts that are not achievable within disciplinary boundaries. From climate science, perhaps because of the lack of empirical analysis of, for example, cityscapes, but from a social science perspective, also because we do not really generally do research that is more future-oriented. The fact that we have framed it more in terms of event-based approaches, I think, is a way of bringing together, bridging the different scales of climate projections and retrospective analysis of social sciences. And I think because there is such attention on the policies and on who is more vulnerable, and the policies and the processes that shape this differential vulnerability, there is potential to generate knowledge that can inform more just policies in terms of adaptation and disaster risk reduction. There are two things that this approach doesn't do. Many others probably you will notice, but importantly, the knowledge remains within academic boundaries. So it is still, I would say, a top-down approach in many ways. It is interdisciplinary, but still very much confined to the traditional scientific disciplines, even if integrated. And it also focuses on business as usual, so on scenarios of current inequalities and systemic oppression and how this will unfold with intensifying climate change. It doesn't leave a lot of space for transformative alternative. Change of a little bit of perspective here, because of course it's quite important to develop scenarios that highlight, emphasize the risks associated with our current economic and political systems and how they might exacerbate inequalities with intensifying climate change. But at the same time, there has been a bit of a critique or a noting within the social sciences that a lot of the information that is generated nowadays, both from climate sciences and from journalists like David Wallace-Wells about uninhabitable Earth, and ideas like the tipping points or the planetary boundaries, which have been popularized recently by a documentary with Rockstrom and Attenborough. I don't know if you've seen it on Netflix. It can also have some negative impacts because it can create a sense of anxiety and a sense of unavoidability of future climate impacts, and that can result in inaction and therefore can result in foreclosing rather than proliferating possibilities. And so one of the four pillars of our Plural Climate Storyline Framework is also that of aspirational storylines. And within this approach, we have also developed one approach on speculative system dynamic modeling, which is grounded a little bit on these three ideas. The first one is from Lefebvre, which is in order to extend the possible, it is necessary to proclaim and desire the impossible. Action and strategy consist in making possible tomorrow what is impossible today. So there is this idea that we also, alongside our business as usual, storylines of business as usual, we have to be, he suggests, in a different context, able to dare to think something of things that may look unachievable today, to make them possible in the future, and to lay the foundation for a different future. Donna Haraway states, it matters what stories make worlds and what worlds make stories. So emphasizing that the narratives, the type of storylines of the futures that we build may shape also the type of futures that actually can materially happen. And so we need to think not only about what will happen or under current circumstances, basically, but also what could happen. And that's actually not so easy to do because we are not used to, not only as academics, but it's not for all to imagine alternatives that we have never experienced. And similarly, Ryan Bellamy says, the climate crisis forces a cognitive transformation. The political challenge of overcoming the relentless drive of an ecologically and socially devastating fossil-fused capitalism is just as much an imaginative project as it is a practical one. And so the importance, again, emphasizing reimagination of our structures, social structures and political structures is as important as the technical challenges of addressing the climate challenge. I won't spend a lot of time on this because I think this has been, my time should be almost over. But we have tried to do an experiment, which I think is the groundwork for more work on different ways of modeling, with a system dynamics model that tried to speculatively bring about a better urban future. The model takes the capitalist city as a starting point and takes the assumption that economic growth leads actually to increased inequalities and environmental consequences. And rather than taking the assumption that economic growth will lead to poverty reduction, which is often an assumption in models, and also considers that cities are shaped by power relations and different visions of the future. So we have different social groups in the cities, we have different vulnerabilities to floods and different visions of the future. And they start as equally balanced. Each of them has the name has the same value. And then with the model, we assume that a number of floods will create greater misalignment in the city, particularly of those who are vulnerable to these floods. And with an increased misalignment, we find a political shift that will lead to focus on different types of policies than the ones promoted by the economic post-capitalistic world. And we have tested then how these different policies shape inequalities and adaptation in the city. Now, this is just a very theoretical conceptual experiment, which is grounded obviously on some theories and some empirical analysis. But it was an interesting experiment to see that the idea of using the model not only to understand certain dynamics, but also to reimagine them in ways that might be more socially just and inclusive. So I think this is a first step of a new approach that we could explore of modeling, and thinking also more of the model as a normative tool to be used to try and achieve certain goals that we have set as a society. And so to conclude, just thinking about what climate science is, and I was thinking, this is an image from a book that has just been published. It's Octavia Butler, who died in 2006, but was a science fiction writer, another way of thinking and predicting the future. She was the first science fiction writer to win a prize, MacArthur Genius Award, I think it's called. And so she was the first to win it. And she thinks, she mentions as part of, rules for predicting the future, she talks about being aware of your perspective. Just a few lines. She says, it's also true that where we stand determines what we are able to see. So I think when we talk about climate knowledge, we always have to consider where we're standing and what we can see from that perspective and what we cannot see from that perspective. And that, I think, is definitely a justification for pluralizing climate knowledge, and as we try to do with our approach. Thank you very much.
Good. If there's any questions from Maria from the room or on Zoom, for those of you who are on Zoom, you can either type in the chat or raise your Zoom hand, and Murat will alert me to that.
Okay,
Yes,
I can
Anastasia.
start with a very basic question. Thank you very much, Maria, for a very nice presentation. So how I'm imagining how these storylines can be used is, for instance, we have a case of disaster unfolding in one city, and we can assume that if we choose the cities that are similar in many, many characteristics to the first city, we can assume that maybe disaster of the same magnitude will unfold in a similar way as comparing to the first example. I was just thinking that I have a feeling that there are so many things that can happen differently in the cities, and you won't be able to control for all these aspects.
No.
And it would just lead to a different disaster in the end. I was just wondering how do you deal with this uncertainty?
So I think so there are definitely aspects that are quite different, and perhaps when you look at it, but there are also some. Let's start with the aspects that are very similar. So when you look at the impacts of some of these events, there are some dynamics, like, for example, both in Cape Town and Maputo, and we found that there is a tendency to respond to a drought by in terms of adaptation by building more infrastructure. And that may or may not work depending on the situation of the infrastructure. But this type of responses, which I think are shaped by sort of global ideas around responses to droughts, we can find them. And we can find that we can find in these different contexts that they will generate some unintended consequences. And some of these are, for example, that lower income groups will be affected the most, overconsumption will be maintained, and we will have still unsustainable consumption. So these are still very general patterns, and this, I think, we have some, we can, let's say, make a storyline with a relative certainty. How then this unfold specifically? Yes, that is going to be difficult to predict. There are so many factors, even how the network is designed differently in different cities, and how the economic levels across neighborhoods, that and many other factors that will play out. So I think it will be helpful to identify some trends and some critical areas that are more at risk. But it's not a prediction, and it will not be able to be used as such. But I think if we were able to present our drought storyline to Maputo, of Maputo to the government, there would be a few things that could be taken as a data to develop an adaptation plan that is more inclusive. But yes, there's going to be still a lot of uncertainty. And when I say granular analysis, I really mean granular analysis, because even the difference between type of pipes in a network will change the way a drought will be experienced between two neighborhoods. And one last point. Some of these differences will not have to come from our work of developing the storyline, but if the storylines are co-produced as I envision, some of this information will come actually from the actors that already know this information.
And now we have a question from Zoom. Julia,
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
loud and clear.
Great, wonderful. So hi, I'm Julia from the Political Science Department of Stockholm University, and I'm writing my PhD on imagining the future after experiencing forest fires. So I think your project was super important, super interesting. Really loved your presentation and citation of Octavia Butler. Really, really great. I have, however, a question. Do you take into account the social capital? Like there are a lot of studies that show that this connections, the local knowledge is so important in reacting to different disasters. So does that go into your model? How do you treat that? And then I didn't quite understand, do you just model how this region will be affected by a future unprecedented event, or do you also model how the region could adapt or be more resilient? Perhaps you could clarify that to me.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your dissertation, your topic sounds really interesting. Your PhD. So in terms of yes, I agree. Social capital is very important. The framework that we developed actually has. I presented only one of the or two of the approaches that we developed, and there is much more about decolonizing climate knowledge. So taking seriously marginalized epistemologies and also co-producing storylines, which I have not discussed today. And in that sense, there are two approaches that we are a big team of people who developed this paper. So there are approaches that have been developed by colleagues who are not here. So I thought I'd focus on the power-sensitive storylines. But I am part of a larger project on African cities, which is really focused on a center focused on co-producing knowledge from the structure of the project, which really delegates, transfers much of the funding to local government and civil society organizations, to the way the research is then produced from locally, really. And that involves, for example, working with the organizations like Slum Dwellers International, who already 20 years have been collecting data on the informal settlements in which they live, highlighting the criticalities in terms of access to basic services and flood risks and drought risks, and then developing this not only as research, but also as a foundation for development strategies. And the project is actually now using those data to develop actually intervention in these cities. So yes, that's one of the ways in which co-production is central to the framework. And there's something that you might find interesting to look into that I also haven't discussed today. I've talked about speculative modeling, but not about normative future visioning, which is another approach Mark Pelling and colleagues have been developing at UCL very much recently. So you have obviously other approaches, feminist approaches, but they have done quite some work which combines future visioning with the co-production of knowledge and solutions, which is, so yes, it's part. And I think for me, the next step would be to think how these different storylines that will emerge from these different interdisciplinary methods, how to bring them together. And that we haven't done, because this is also partly a work of a perspective paper. And so I think we are still at the beginning of the process. In the model, for the moment, we have used an imaginary city. It was really an experiment for me, it was an experiment to think if political ecology knowledge can be used in more speculative ways, combining it with methods used by other disciplines. But it's so it was to propose more speculative approaches in social sciences, really. And we are now developing a new model slowly, which is instead based on a city. And there we could consider more co-produced approaches to the model.
Okay, perhaps you take the next question from Zoom and then one from the room after that. So Carlos.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. I do have some connection problems, so I apologize. I don't think my camera is working.
It is. Yes, we can see you.
Oh, thank you. Good, good. I'm part of a climate risk initiative in the largest reinsurer in Brazil, IRB. And, we've had a very unfortunate flood, a big flood in the south of Brazil this year. So this is a big concern and issue for us. So I was just, and thank you very much for your presentation. It's very interesting. But we are very interested in getting to know if you know of a good projection models to flood and drought risk that they have proven to be good indicators in the longer term. Because on an insurance perspective, we are very much interested in a longer term, like 1 year or 2 to 5 years, so that the risks can be insured properly. So I was just wondering if you know of these projection models.
I think that, Gabriele, you should take this one.
Yes, so I mean, it's an interesting problem because I guess you work with yearly contracts, and most, correct me if I'm wrong, but most reinsurance contracts are for a single big event during the duration of the contract. So that is a very tricky question because you're essentially asking about the threshold exceedance, which over a period of several years is actually quite hard to quantify robustly. So I would say it's a very specific question that we don't often ask in climate science, because in climate science we don't try to answer the question, is the event going to be just below a given threshold or just above? Because that's not the type of scientific question that we pose when we do this modeling. So my short answer would be that you can get these sort of values from climate models numerically, quantitatively, but it's not what the models are designed to give you. So how good these estimates would be is an open matter.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. So I think, Ricardo, you had a question here from the room.
Yes, thank you very much. So you mentioned that your storylines envision like worst case and best case scenarios.
No, I would say the storylines that we've done, I would like them to envision best and worst, or best business as usual, which I think is bad scenario given the current situation. And I think that's what they really envision at the moment with the approach, the power sensitive approach. But I would like to so the idea of combining this with the normative future visioning that I have been discussed so much, that I haven't discussed because it's work done more at the UCL with the normative future visioning, is that those could be storylines that are more transformative, because the storylines that we develop, they give us a sense of what will happen here or in a certain context if socioeconomic inequalities and structural inequalities are not addressed and climate intensifies. But they don't give us a lot of room to think about alternatives. So normative future visioning, which instead focuses on working with local actors to envision their adaptation strategies, would then generate storylines that are, I would say, a best case scenario because they're more transformative. But I haven't presented. So what you've seen today was only the business as usual or bad case scenarios.
Good. So I think we are approaching the end of the seminar. So thanks everyone who joined and who asked questions, and especially thank you to Maria for the presentation and discussion. So anyone who has any further questions is welcome to contact Maria directly. And for those of you that are physically here, she's around for a short while longer after the seminar. So take your occasion, because I don't think she's going to be here tomorrow.
He says he's not going to invite me anymore, basically. That was the end. I'll take this 5 minutes because then
it's over after this. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you.